welcome to the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we have the pleasure of the company of Mr. Ambassador Luis-Alfonso de Alba, Permanent Representative of Mexico to the United Nations. Thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much to you for the invitation.
And before we start with our conversation with Mr. Ambassador de Alba, we'd like to introduce the country of Mexico briefly, as we normally do. Mexico is located in North America, bordering the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico between Belize and the United States, and bordering the North Pacific Ocean between Guatemala and the United States. The area of the country is slightly less than 3 times the size of Texas. It covers the area of 1,964,375 square kilometers. Natural resources are petroleum, silver, copper, gold, lead, zinc, natural gas, and timber. 12% of the land use is arable, permanent crops 1%, and other 86%. Some of the biggest environmental challenges of Mexico are hazardous waste disposal facilities, widespread erosion, desertification, deteriorating agricultural lands, and serious air and water pollution in the national capital and urban centers along US-Mexico border. Despite some economic growth in recent years, the administration continues to face many economic challenges, including improving the public education system, upgrading infrastructure, modernizing labor laws, and fostering private investment in the energy sector. The population still under poverty line is around 51%. And we would also like to introduce our guest personally, because he has a really impressive record as an international negotiator, as a diplomat, and a very important actor in all kinds of international events, agreements, conventions, conferences, and commissions.
I would say that I have been lucky enough to go through almost all the topics at the United Nations. There is one piece which is in addition to what you read,
yes, please, yeah.
Which is the fact that I was a special ambassador for climate change, responsible of the negotiations for the Cancun agreements, which were able to bring into track negotiations on climate change. So dealing with global issues, dealing with vulnerable groups or specific areas of concerns on the global agenda has been the main objective of my.
And you were nominated for the Chatham Prize at that moment, right?
Because of the climate change negotiations.
And you
yes.
putting back on track the whole climate change agenda.
Yeah.
That was
we had
sidetracked, stagnant.
Mexico has a huge challenge because we took the presidency immediately after Denmark, and as you may remember, there were a lot of expectation to get an agreement, an important agreement at the meeting in Copenhagen in 2010. And it collapsed because it was not accepted at the last minute, the deal, even though there was a very large participation of leaders, head of state and government at that meeting. So we had to reconstruct the process, rebuild some trust, some understanding among the delegations, and we were able to do that within 1 year, which was a major challenge. Among other things, obviously the Mexican government devoted a lot of resources and a lot of personal commitment from the president to a number of ministries and officials. And I personally had to travel close to 280 days during the preparation of the Cancun, 280 days out of 364. That makes a continuous flight around the world, trying to address the concerns of different players. We were able to rescue on substance most of what was needed in terms of reductions of emissions, in terms of commitment to transfer financial resources, in terms of transfer of the technology. But the task is still huge because we still need to go to a point on which we will be able to draft a new treaty, a legally binding treaty that will define the commitments or obligations for all countries.
Where do we stand right now regarding the legally binding treaty on carbon emissions? What's the situation, and what are the possibilities in the near future? Right now, what do you see?
I think it is possible, it is feasible. Cancun set up the ground because Cancun identified a number of actions and commitments specifically, and allow for a number of countries immediately after Cancun to put it in writing. There is a commitment to reduce emissions by not less than 60, 70 countries, which is already in black and white. And by doing that, together with the commitment to create the Green Fund and, for financing those changes and taking particular attention to adaptation, especially for those countries which are victims of climate change, not responsible, you have all the elements really for the treaty. What we need is to break with an understanding that responsibilities goes to the north and victims are in the south, because I don't think it is longer true. Certainly.
How do you see?
Well, the U.S., to give an example, or the European countries in general have certainly greater responsibilities that most of the developing countries actually today, and if you take it from an historic perspective, even more. But it doesn't mean that this is going to continue to be that way. The level of emissions of countries like China or India or even Mexico, Brazil, have increased to a level on which we do have responsibilities also vis-a-vis other developing countries. And we may soon even have greater responsibilities in terms of emissions that developed countries. Mexico emits today more than many European countries, and China emits more than everybody else, including the US. So that situation, that change, implies that we will also undertake some commitments to reduce our own emissions and to support other countries.
So what do you think needs to be changed in the way we approach this legally binding treaty so that all countries could feel comfortable and would really want to join?
You need to have a recognition of that reality. That has been done by Mexico. Mexico has already committed to go for a legally binding treaty on which we will assume obligations. But some other countries not, especially some middle or emerging economies. They have asked for some time frame to do that. The agreement that we reached in Durban immediately after Cancun was in the sense that we will look for the treaty to be negotiated before 2015, but looking into a treaty that could enter into force only after 2020. For Mexico, it is a little bit too late. For some other countries, it's still too soon.
For the world, it might be a little bit too late.
For the world, it may be too late, but it is always better than not to have an agreement. Now, I think the emphasis has to be on getting that treaty by 2015. The last meeting of the Conference of the Parties was not very encouraging in that sense, because there is still a lot of reluctance. We have not enter into a negotiations already. We need a draft on the table, and we need to start looking into articles, but it can be done, and the next 2 years are going to be critical for that. Hopefully we can get it, as I said, by 2015 at a meeting which has been already identified as a meeting that can take place in France, in Paris. So we may have a Paris Treaty.
And it's going to take place when? In
2015, by the end of 2015.
Right. Yeah. So let me ask you another question related to that. Being so immersed in these negotiations and leading them, what is the lesson from these negotiations in Cancun that you think is applicable to other negotiations within the United Nations system?
Well, I think there are two main lessons. The first one has to be has to do with the process. Processes at the UN are very obsolete, and they need to be renovated, and we were able to do that. We were able to gain sufficient trust among different parties from the north, the south, all corners. And by getting the trust, we were able to innovate and develop a number of processes. We use informal consultations, thematic informal consultations in a very dynamic way at different levels of hierarchy. We also use a wide range of facilitators. We identify a number of ministers that will lead processes on the negotiations on specific topics, and at the end we were given as not only the host country but mainly as the president of the conference, we were given the space to put together a piece of paper or a package that was, the moment it was introduced into the room, people was standing and applauding even before it was discussed.
So there was a great participatory process, I think so, on all levels.
But flexible. We involve a lot of personalities from different levels of government, but we also involve private sector, NGOs, academicians, academic people. We had a number of thematic discussions with the partners on views of indigenous peoples, for instance, on climate change were quite particularly useful. Women participation, youth people involved, unions. So it was a very, I would say, a very open, but at the same very much guided process because it was recognized.
So this is the secret: balance the inclusiveness and also goal orientation.
People tend to say that an inclusive, transparent, and democratic process at the UN is the best way to solve things, but at the same time they forget that inclusiveness and transparency and democracy doesn't mean that everybody deals with try to draft the same paragraph at the same time. Right. When you go to the UN and you see a room of more than 200-300 people and then a text on the screen, it's not democracy, it's not inclusiveness, it is a mess. Because there are different... Good
differentiation.
there are so many different ways of drafting a single paragraph. Even if we agree on the substance, we can draft it in so many different manners that it is an endless process. I can revise my own text a number of times.
Oh, we have that experience on a daily basis. We edit and re-edit, right? Everything is...
And that's what needs to be changed. We need to make sure that people understand that democracy, transparency, inclusiveness, etc., as in any other parliament in the world, relies a lot on preparatory work, which needs to be done by smaller groups of persons and countries, and the key is never to assume that something which comes from a committee, a working group, or an informal consultation is going to be for taking or leave it purposes. You need to assume that anything you produce in a smaller setting will need to be formally validated and openly discussed in a plenary room, and then you follow the parliamentarian example. The second difference on Cancun, which is also very important, is what I was already referring to, by recognizing that the issues are not black and white, and the international community is not good and bad, it's not north and south. There are so many differences that we need to take into account, and we need to take it into account in a positive way. Unfortunately, the UN structure doesn't facilitate that, because the grouping format in the UN tends to polarize the discussion. You have a position from the developed countries, and if not all developed countries, all WEOC countries as we call it, at least you have the European Union with a consolidated position, and then on the other side you have the G77, which has the large majority of developing countries. And negotiating, discussing among groups normally is the worst scenario, because each of the groups need to go first to the lower common denominator. And then the negotiations start between the two groups, and it may even lower. We do not take into account the richness of the diversity. Try to imagine how different the interests of the US vis-a-vis the interest of Italy, or even more the interest of Malta may be.
Or even Dominican Republic.
Now take it in the Dominican Republic vis-a-vis China, or vis-a-vis Brazil or Mexico. There are nuances which are positive. This principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities needs to be applied from one country to the other.
But differentiated
Common but differentiated responsibilities and differentiated capabilities also. This is a principle which is very common. It's in the convention on at the time we talk about climate change, but I think it is applicable for many other processes, particularly if we are dealing about global problems. Whenever there is a global problem, there are common responsibilities and there are different capabilities, and you can take it from, you can include an historic perspective to be fair. At the end, the key word is equity. If we develop the concept of equity and we all feel that we are contributing to the solution or to the burden, you can put it in positive or to the solution in a fair manner, because it has been shared on an equitable basis among the international community, then everybody moves. It's much easier. You cannot accept, it's difficult to accept at least, that one country may say that they are going to contribute with X, whether we are talking about reduction of emissions or financial resources, and they have decided to contribute with the X because that's a sovereign decision. With all due respect, it doesn't work any longer. Each of us has a certain level of moral, political contribution to make, and if you go under that level, you can be finger pointing. You should be finger pointing because you are not assuming your own capabilities or using your own capabilities and trying to solve the problem.
Let me ask you a few more questions on the United Nations, and I think we'll finish with a few questions on Mexico, your own country.
Yes, absolutely.
So Margaret Hayward, our representative to the United Nations, is here with us, and she has some questions formulated by us, by GFDD, and also a question that came from one of our members of the audience that's participating in the Committee for Finance and Development.
Pleasure.
Yeah, we noted, Ambassador, that Mexico initiated the Group of Friends of UN Reform, which brought to the fore a strengthening of ECOSOC and other greater coherence of UN bodies. Could you comment a little bit more about that, Mexico's engagement in that and the reform of the organization in particular?
Well, the story is a very long one, but let me very briefly refer to, since the creation of the UN, Mexico has been pushing for a balance between the political and the economic and social agenda. And that's why we fight for ECOSOC to become a main body of the organization, not just a subsidiary body of the General Assembly, not just another committee. We were successful to some extent because we got ECOSOC as a main body, but still full of deficiencies in terms of the charter itself, because it conditions some of the decision, or it subordinates some of the decision of ECOSOC to the General Assembly. And I would say even more by taking away from the UN a large part of the agenda, which is the financial agenda, and by establishing and giving the prominence to the Bretton Woods institutions, to the World Bank and the IMF. Nonetheless, ECOSOC has been trying to play this role of balancing the agenda, putting the social and economic agenda on the top, and more recently, more openly, the environmental agenda on the top. So in this context, what we are trying to do right now is through the reform of ECOSOC or the strengthening of ECOSOC, is to go back to the fundamentals in terms of recognizing that the UN is not going to play a role on a number of areas. because of the Bretton Woods institutions, because of development that have taken place recently, on which even those organizations have showed limitations, and that therefore we have gone to the G20 format and other informal gatherings, and at the same time rescue what the UN can contribute to the process. So recognizing its own limitations, we also need to recognize and develop our own strengths. And we see the main strength in the UN as a place on which we have, first of all, a convening power which nobody else has, because we have a universal membership, and we have a number of principles that allow countries of all sizes and with all kind of policies to participate actively into the process. So we need just to add to that participation of non-state actors. And if you have a great legitimacy in terms of membership and you are able to bring new actors into the game, your convening capacity would be excellent. New actors, why? Well, it's simple. New actors include different members of government. It's no longer the time on which an ambassador used to travel to Europe to go to a negotiation and he needed to have full powers. He will take 1-2 months to get to the conference, 2-3 months to negotiate, and then back with the commitments. Today, the Ministry of Labor or the Ministry of Education, and certainly the Ministers of Finance, and negotiate directly with their own pairs. They attend meetings, they exchange emails, etc. So even within a government, you cannot assume that one ministry, one person, can commit the whole government. So you need to recognize that, which is a fact, at a greater level. You need to include local authorities, which they were not usually involved. You need to include parliamentarians, which had their parallel meetings, but they didn't have such an open door. And even more, you need to involve the private sector. You need civil society in general, once again, because they are going to contribute to the solutions, whether we are talking about understanding a problem, information, knowledge, science and technology that may be useful to addressing issues, as well as financial resources. Take the example of climate change and resources for addressing climate change. We have estimated them at around $100 billion by year before the 2020 or by 2020. No less than half of that money will need to come from private sources, because it would be impossible from governmental funds. So coming back to the reform, if you take advantage of your convening capacity, involve the new actors, more active in the preparation of the process and obviously in the follow-up, then you just need to do something which we were supposed to be able to do since '92, which was to have a balanced agenda for development. And therefore we introduced, we made sure that to put it in writing in Rio recently, last year, the environmental component, which was missing from ECOSOC. The ECOSOC is the Council for Social and Economic Development. Now it is environment, the three pillars, the environmental pillar, the economic pillar, and the social pillar, that need to be balanced, and we need to develop that.
And actually that fits into an outside question that we got from our Financing for Development Committee, of which GFDD is a big part. They wanted to know your views on financing for development process and how it can be integrated into the finance sustainable development.
Well, I think we need to be quite critic. We need to, having recognized that the meeting in Monterrey for Financing for Development has been one of the most successful in the UN history, because the document is really good, it's really balanced and comprehensive. We have been very bad in following that and implementing, and not only implementing, just keeping track of what has been done. At the time, we wanted to innovate, and we didn't want to have a traditional meeting of follow-up at the level of expert in New York. And we decided that something new needed to be created, and we invented the so-called spring dialogues. and an open dialogue which will be held 1 year within ECOSOC and 1 year in the General Assembly, and the main intention was to have this kind of dialogue with different stakeholders, and Bretton Woods institutions were very much in the center of the picture, but not only them. But if you look into the way in which we have implemented the decision is far from being desirable. Those meetings have become a talking show. Level of participation has diminished a lot. So we need first to rethink about how to implement the Monterrey consensus and how to do the follow-up at the same time. And we need to do that now in having in mind what has been decided also in Rio and conference like the one in Cancun, on which the component of financing for sustainable development or the financing for activities against the fight against climate change or to protect biodiversity, etc., will complement each other. We cannot have financing for different topics, assuming that there are different pockets on which we can draw the money. The money is in one pocket and is relatively limited, so we need to put the whole development agenda with its social, environmental and economic component, and then see how do we finance that package. And once again, we need to be also realistic. There are responsibilities, obligations on developed countries, and we need to keep that. The percentage is 0.7, the 0.7 percentage of the GDP of the developed countries still need to be reached as money that would be transferred to developing countries. But there is also a financial crisis, there is an economic crisis on many countries, so we need to be aware that difficulties are going to continue for at least a few years. And because of that, together with the new realities on which you have economies which are growing fast, which are stronger, which have the capacity to contribute, like the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the South Africans, the Mexicans, the Indonesians, the Koreans, the Thailands, the Singapores. There are not so few. We are talking about probably close to 40, 60 countries among the developing countries which may have that kind of contribution. In our own region, there are several. Those countries need to step up, and they need not to take the responsibilities of the North, which have not been delivered, but their own responsibilities vis-à-vis other countries. So do you have a possibility of South-South cooperation and South-South financing, which need to be taken into account. In a reform ECOSOC on which you have a balanced agenda, open participation of different stakeholders, you will add also the resources of the private sector and other sources. So you have a kind of an abanico, I don't know how to say that, of options on which there is no variety of options on which you cannot focus on only one of them. You need to adjust. And depending on the countries, depending on the priorities, you will also need to adjust. It's not going to be the same set of options for a least developed country or a small island state that is going to be to a middle income country in the developing world, and even less for an emerging economy which is more powerful. Those are the nuances on which we need to take into account. For the time being, there is a working group that has been established to debate or to identify possible avenues of work for financing for sustainable development. That working group will start meeting probably by the end of this month, next month, and we need that working group to join the follow-up of the Monterrey consensus with the innovation that I was referring, and eventually put in a proposal that will go along with the redefinition of the goals for development post-2015.
Is there any possibility that the Commission would be created at some point?
I don't think a commission for the time being. This working group will present some ideas and proposals for a text. Hopefully we will be able to take on board these recommendations or agreements in building for the agenda post 2015. In parallel, I think we will continue to discuss whether to have a commission or not. There is a resolution of the General Assembly that keeps the idea open. But if I can be very honest, very frank, I don't think a commission of the UN solves anything at this stage. Most of the commissions of the UN are so bureaucratic, so slow.
So it wouldn't be a real contribution to solving
That's exactly what we were trying to avoid in Monterrey. Unless we build something new, and then we should not call it commission. We have created something new in Rio. We are trying to put it together, which is, we call it the High Political Forum. We didn't say commission or council, we say forum, because we intend through this labeling to open the door for different stakeholders.
So you get a wider diversity and more participation.
You can get other institutions, specialized institutions, IMF or World Bank, but also ILO, and you can get even regional organizations, regional committees involved. Certainly, different actors of civil society. So by keeping the word forum, you open the door. And by saying high political forum without saying for sustainable development or for development, but coming from the Rio Plus 20 and the ECOSOC process of reform, then you give a political dimension to the development agenda. And we are still discussing what is going to be the frequency of those meetings, who is going to prepare, etc., because it's an innovative agenda. Yeah. The first time I put it in paper, because it was before Rio, it was seen as, because it was originally a proposal from Mexico that later got approved. But the first time I put it in paper, the people was looking into the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, and yeah, to a certain extent you can make that parallel, because you have participation which is not only governmental, but at a high level it is totally different. My own proposal, my own idea is that these kind of meetings will be held every year at the ministerial level, and every 4 or 5 years could be held at the head of state level, so that you will be able to balance the agenda, because only head of state can do that balance. You cannot ask a Ministry of Environment to decide on issues who have to do with financing, and you cannot ask the Minister of Finance.
The heads of state are the only unifying force. Yeah.
To be honest, they normally never met. In the follow-up, in the preparation of Cancun, I can give you an anecdote. Once the President called on the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Economy for a meeting. And he said, I want you to address the issue of the proposal for the Green Fund and the preparation of Cancun. And the first intervention was the Ministry of Finance asking permission to leave and leave his deputy, because the crisis in Europe was at its peak, and he had a few telephone calls, and the President immediately reacted saying, no way, this is priority number one for us. Climate change is not an environmental issue, it's not a sectorial issue, it's an issue that affects the whole development plan for Mexico. So
you have to stay.
You have to stay. And it was the first time in which all those ministers were talking about climate change. Right. Because before that it was a topic for discussion at the Ministry of Environment or Foreign Affairs.
Let me ask you a question about Mexico.
Yes.
So let's go back to your home country, and let's conclude the conversation talking about what's going on in Mexico right now. Newly elected President Enrique Peña Nieto was successful in proposing his reform agenda, but his reform agenda changed. So,
not really. No.
What's the reaction? What are the expectations?
Well, he has developed an agenda during the campaign, and even more during the transition from the elections to the assumption of the presidency. We have a quite long transition, more than almost 5 months. So he was able to put a number of proposals and ideas on the table, but I think even more importantly, he was able to get a deal with the other two main political parties in Mexico in such a way that only a few days after he took office, a pact was signed by the three main parties, the former the president party and the left, together with the PRI. And that pact has a number of commitments, more than 90, which takes the President Peña Nieto agenda and obviously complement nuance with the agendas of other parties. But in order to address some of the fundamental issues that were pending, some of which you mentioned in your own introduction, we have already gone through a reform on labor that has been successfully approved or passed. Recently, we have also the education reform passed, and important changes are to be introduced in the very near future. But we still have a number of critical reforms to be achieved, which you cannot achieve without the support of Congress. Remember that in Mexico there is no one single party who can control Congress, so you need to make alliances. And those reforms are, the first one is the one on the fiscal reform, of the taxes, because the government has to reduce its own dependency on the revenues of oil to finance social and economic and infrastructure, etc. And this is a critical reform which different governments have been unable to get, and hopefully this time, because of this pact, will be achievable. There is the energy reform also, which is part of this pact, and the possibility that you explicitly mentioned of having a private investment into the research and exploitation of oil in Mexico. Those two reforms are going to be critical to allow the country to continue to grow. We have been doing well in terms of the economy, and I think the finances are quite solid, and but the possibility of bypassing the level of 3.5–4% growth every year will only come through this kind of reform.
So there are great expectations on the reform,
Huge.
and it's an important historical moment for Mexico.
Absolutely, because I think he was
Everybody's
able to
hoping that the parties and the politicians will be able to capitalize on.
They have, because the price that each of the parties will pay by breaking this deal is going to be high.
And disappointing.
The expectations are huge. I would say even bigger probably outside of Mexico than in Mexico, but not because Mexicans do not want those reforms and do not want Mexico to grow, but Mexicans, we are more skeptical than anybody else. So the change in the perception outside is certainly going to take a little longer in Mexico to be assumed. We still have to fight with the huge problem of crime and drugs, which is a terrible problem that needs to be tackled in parallel to these processes of reform. But having this half empty, half full glass, I think we are in.
That's what we all live with, especially in developing countries.
And I think there are great expectations. There is a team also, which I think it is important that President Peña Nieto has been able to put together, on which you combine experience and
innovation and freshness. Well, we definitely want to wish a lot of success to President Peña Nieto and to his team. And a lot of success to you also to continue successfully leading committees, commissions, conferences, and helping the world get together and make agreements. And we want to thank you once again for coming over and taking your precious time to answer a few questions.
Thank you very much to
So
both
thank
of
you so much, Ambassador, and we hope to see you soon at one of the United Nations fora.
Yes, certainly, and hopefully not fighting for a comma, but fighting for something
For
which will be
something
more
real that will
substantial.
be beneficial to people and the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so
Pleasure.
much. Thank you for watching the Global Roundtable organized by the Global Foundation for Democracy and Development. Today we had the pleasure of the company of Mr. Ambassador Luis-Alfonso de Alba, Permanent Representative of Mexico to the United Nations.